Welcome to So What, where we talk to experts about one thing that they think is unexpectedly important that everyone should know about. I'm Sean.
And I'm Madhurima, and today we have with us Christopher Shaw, who is a mathematics faculty member at Columbia College, Chicago, where he teaches, among other things, a course on math in art and nature. Chris is Sean and my friend and colleague. We started about the same time at Columbia College, Chicago. We were actually on sabbatical at the same time recently. And during that sabbatical, Chris wrote a book inspired by that math and art and nature course, including a chapter on the topic that he's talking with us about today, the golden ratio. So, Chris, thank you for being here. What is the golden ratio and why should we care about it?
I want to just start by saying thanks for having me. I would say that what I think your listeners should care about is not caring about the golden ratio, and that not caring can come in a performative way, as I do sometimes like to do myself. But really, I think it's about unlearning some of the ways in which the golden ratio has become bound into the cultural understanding of math and art. And I think that there are a lot of different ways in which we're doing some subconscious things when we associate the golden ratio with math and art all the time.
Now, I'm really curious, Chris, because I'm not exactly sure. What is the golden ratio?
Well, actually, Sean, when we talked earlier, I believe you even said before you can decide that we need to stop caring about the golden ratio, you need to understand why people do care or even believe that people do care.
Yeah. And that's even better. That's even better. Yeah.
Sure. So as Madhurima mentioned, I'm a faculty member in mathematics at Columbia, and I teach this math and art and nature class. And when I first started talking about teaching this class again, it had been sort of dormant. I had conversations with friends and colleagues at Columbia, and as you know, Columbia is an arts-focused school. So a lot of the colleagues and students that I talk to are also focused in the arts and in design. And the conversations that I would have, people would come up to me and say, "Oh, so you're going to teach math and art and nature? That's so cool. I can't wait. There's so many different connections between math and art." And the first thing they always bring up is the golden ratio. And so some cultural touchstones that go along with the golden ratio are ingrained all over the understanding of people who are interested in the arts and just like in culture broadly. So there's this really big kind of fire hose of information about the golden ratio that I feel like overwhelms the popular landscape when someone talks about math and art. If you Google math and art, I guarantee you the first page of search results will mostly be about the golden ratio. But I don't think there's actually a ton of popular knowledge about what it really is, what it's classified as, why it's called a ratio and not a number when we actually treat it as a number. So I guess I want to, if I can indulge you for a few minutes, to actually talk about what the golden ratio is. Would that be okay?
Yeah, we're going to need it, I think.
Absolutely, because you said it like 40 times there, and it only made me want to know more about what it actually is.
Even though I'm telling you shouldn't know much about it.
I can't start not caring about it until I know what it is.
Right. Fair. And I should also say, I've said the phrase golden ratio a bunch of times, but there are also some other ways in which it's referred to. You will see it referred to as the golden section, the golden mean, the divine proportion.
Yeah, that one's my favorite.
And you'll also hear it referred to just by the letter phi, the Greek letter phi. So if we were doing a video podcast, I'd have a lot of pictures. Instead, I'm going to just try to give you a kind of an audio explanation. And the first thing to recognize is that there's one weird thing about it, which is usually in mathematics and just more broadly in our understanding of what a ratio is. A ratio involves two quantities. You're comparing one number to another one. But the golden ratio is actually one number. It's just a number. It's a real number. It's the number 1 plus the square root of 5, the whole thing divided by 2. And the way it's defined, so if you take a rectangle, there's a very special rectangle, and that rectangle, perhaps not surprisingly, is called a golden rectangle. But if you draw this rectangle, and again, I'm putting my hands up in the air and drawing a rectangle. You'll have to do that for yourself as an audio listener. If you draw this rectangle and then you imagine cutting off the biggest square that you can make in that rectangle. So the rectangle has a length and a width. And if you take a square that has the same length and width as the width of the bigger rectangle, you cut off that big square, you're going to have another rectangle left over. So if you think about your rectangle laying horizontally, then when you cut off that big square, your other rectangle is going to look like it's standing up vertically. If you started with a rectangle and then you cut off that square, and then the rectangle that you have left over is similar, has the same proportion of sides to the original rectangle that you started with, then that rectangle was golden. So that larger rectangle is golden. You cut off the largest square that you can make, and then the smaller rectangle that's kind of that thinner strip standing up, is also a golden rectangle. And if you keep following that pattern, if you cut off the biggest square in a kind of clockwise pattern, you start to build something that looks a little bit spirally. This series of kind of nested squares that always have one little rectangle left in the middle. And if you keep doing this process, you eventually kind of make that rectangle look so small that it looks like it disappears. And if you connect the corners of those squares all the way through, you'll end up with something else that's called a golden spiral in the popular literature. There are a couple of other ways to define it. There's a way to define it that's using something called a geometric mean. There's a way of defining it using something called continued fractions. And then there is a way of defining it using the Fibonacci sequence. But that rectangle is kind of the most common way of thinking about the golden rectangle. And the golden rectangle is a rectangle where the ratio of the longer side in the rectangle to the shorter side is equal to this number. This number, 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. But that's sort of the end of describing what the actual number is. And so as a math person, I have all kinds of numbers that I think are interesting that no one else cares about or knows anything about. There are all kinds of different mathematical curiosities. I know, Madhurima, you've recently learned about the Banach-Tarski paradox. This is a thing that some people have heard of, but maybe hasn't transcended into the popular culture. Certainly my mom has never heard of the Banach-Tarski paradox. The Goldbach conjecture, another cool thing. I invite your listeners to look these things up. They have cool definitions, and they're interesting to talk about mathematically, but the only people that would really care about them are people in the worlds of math and adjacent fields. The golden ratio, though, somehow has a much bigger ego than those other ideas, and that's had a number of dramatic consequences. So if you Google the golden ratio and art right now, you're going to get just pages and pages with links that talk about harmoniousness and balance that are tied to the golden ratio. You'll see pictures of paintings and artwork with frames written on top of them or spirals drawn on them.
Sure.
There's all these different ways in which it shows up. There's also this famous leaked Pepsi rebranding prospectus from an advertising company. It focuses on math history. It talks about mathematics from prehistory to today and ties in all this stuff to the golden ratio. And it's so hokey and ridiculous that it's become a meme, both in like the internet sense and also in the cultural sense of what a meme is. So this is something that I think people actually do care about. And it really does have this kind of ubiquity in the world of math and art.
You mentioned memes and its widespread popularity, which kind of reminds me that one of the places that people will see at least a sort of precipitate of this is when I open my camera app, this grid appears on the screen that has 9 squares, right? And the grid appears to help me compose my photo in the best possible way, right? And a lot of these ideas about the composition of photos are traced right back to a sort of idea of the golden ratio, right?
I have that grid as well on some of the camera apps on my phone. And some of those phones actually give you multiple options about how to compose your photo. And what you might have been seeing on yours was the standard rule of thirds. But one understanding of where the rule of thirds came from is that actually it descends from the idea that you should be dividing your rectangular screen up into a grid of golden rectangles first. And so that there's actually something called the golden rule of thirds, which is, similar. It won't look super different to someone who's just pointing and shooting. But yeah, this kind of composition is, at least in one understanding, is actually descended from the idea of using the golden ratio to divide up the rectangles.
Okay, well, this has been really convincing about why the golden ratio is important. But you were telling us that we really shouldn't be caring so much about it. And I feel like you're doing a terrible job.
So first of all, thank you. I have enough trouble trying to get my students interested in the topics that I want to talk about with them. So if I'm able to convince you that the golden ratio is at least somewhat interesting at the beginning, then I think that's great. But part of what's interesting to talk about is how wrong everything that we understand about it culturally is. So I'm going to start with the mathematician side of it, which is that it sort of bugs me when mathematics is incorrect. So first of all, almost every time if you do a popular search on the golden ratio on Google, you're going to get information that's just not mathematically accurate. So, for example, one of the things that I like to show my students as a red herring is a picture of the Mona Lisa with a golden ratio grid drawn on it. And
right.
And if you just leave people to talk about it, they'll talk about how the composition follows all the lines in the grid and everything's great. And then when I actually take a ruler to it and show them, this actually was not a golden rectangle, nothing about this grid is golden in any way, it sort of forces you to walk that back a little bit. A lot of the times that we think of things as having a composition related to the golden ratio, there are plenty of other examples as well. It's just not correct.
Can we talk about some of those examples? Because I'm remembering in reading for this episode that the Nautilus, that spiral shape is not actually a golden spiral, but is generally held as one.
Yeah, so there are many different spirals that are interesting. Almost every spiral that a person could talk about has some kind of a mathematical definition to it. And there is a specific kind of spiral that's called a golden spiral. There's also a class of spirals called logarithmic spirals. But in this spiral of this describing the shape of this nautilus shell, the nautilus shell does satisfy roughly a logarithmic spiral, but it's not a golden spiral. A golden spiral is a very specific type where the ratio of the different lengths of the successive bands and widths satisfies the golden ratio. So to call it a golden spiral is just a misnomer. It really is a logarithmic spiral, and it's still cool. It doesn't have to be golden to be cool. It's still cool to me that if I magnified the picture of a nautilus shell, that I would still have roughly the same shape as I zoom in. So it's cool. It's just not.
Yeah, okay,
golden.
that's cool.
So, but it does lend us to the question of all these other things that then get referred to as golden. So the Parthenon,
Right.
the Great Pyramid, right? There's something going on
Vitruvian
here.
Man.
Yeah.
The Vitruvian Man is especially, and is another sort of Da Vinci ideas, right? The Last Supper.
Yep. The Parthenon is a good example of this, where the Parthenon is a building in the shape of a rectangle. Fine. It also has a triangular kind of top. I don't know if you'd call it. Is it a cornice?
No, I'm pretty sure top is the technical term for it.
The roof has a triangular construction. There's also a set of stairs that lead up to the Parthenon, and there's a kind of framing that goes around it. If you're going to decide that something is a golden rectangle, or if you're going to measure it and ask whether it's a golden rectangle, you have to decide what to measure, right? So there are all these different ways that you could measure that building to decide whether or not the framing of it is golden. And if you found that there were 4 or 5 different options and one of them was roughly golden and the other ones weren't, well, it would be really easy to just say the one that counts is the one that actually has the golden ratio in it.
Right. And this, I think, brings up so many interesting things. I'm remembering from one of the pieces that you'd recommended to us by George Markowsky, who talked about how there's no real evidence that, there's evidence that Da Vinci was really interested in and knew about the golden ratio because he illustrated a book that was called, I think, translated The Divine Proportion, which is, a reference to the golden ratio. But Markowsky argues that there's actually no evidence to suggest that he used any of those ideas anywhere else, including in the drawing of the Vitruvian Man, where we decide that the golden ratio fits. But to decide that the golden ratio fits, we have to decide that the navel is an important part of the human body, right?
And I want to just note the quote from Markowsky here is great. The navel is a scar of no great importance on an adult human. The navel is a scar of no great importance on an adult human being.
Right.
As a guy who has had 2 children, I do feel like the navel was kind of really important, at least for 9 months of their lives. So I'm not totally convinced of the lack of.
He says adult human being.
Sure. But there's some kind of a trace element of that I don't know, feels like I could see where someone would find some importance to it. But his point is good. And as Madhurima is kind of hinting at, like in the Vitruvian Man, again, there's no actual contemporaneous note from Da Vinci that says that he's using the golden proportion for any of this. And how did you decide that the navel was the particular ratio that you care about, right? There are all sorts of other different body parts that are at different distances away from other body parts. So who really cares about this specific one, except for the fact that, just like with the Parthenon, if you found, this one is golden in this quote unquote idealized person, that must mean the golden ratio is really important. And in fact, the Vitruvian Man is a good example to talk about a little bit more, because it's also just one of many different examples of other cultures deciding that they were going to kind of honor whatever they considered to be the idealized human body and what the idealized human body ratios are. So if we can just take a moment to acknowledge that in and of itself is a really problematic way of looking at human beings,
right,
and saying that we have an idea what a perfect body ratio is, and that, in the absence of any other conversation, you can infer that anybody that doesn't meet those standards is not perfect.
Well, and this is the history of racism. This is the history of colonialism. This is the history of, trying to establish what symmetry is. This is what phrenology is. This is scientific racism in the late 19th century, which coincidentally is the time when the golden ratio really takes off as an important concept for people to turn to and try and uncover in previous works, right? So obviously we've been talking about Da Vinci, and that's important. And we know that before Da Vinci was Fibonacci. And so obviously thinking about the Fibonacci sequence is not something that's actually invented in the 1800s or in the 19th century. But like so many things, it's part of a larger culture and obsession with symmetry and beauty that actually is set in place to enforce hierarchy of, value.
Yeah, and the fact that the golden ratio is being applied to this standard of beauty is problematic in itself, right? It's obviously has all the context behind it that you're mentioning. And it's also just not true that the golden ratio has any place of privilege. It's not the first, it's not the last time that someone has tried to make one of these idealized human bodies and talk about it.
It's almost as though there's actually nothing inherently better about the golden ratio, and that those the rationale of the perfect human body or perfect beauty or perfect aesthetics has actually nothing to do with one rule.
Yeah.
I mean, not to go off on a tangent, but this is actually interestingly been one of the themes that's come up over and over again in several of these episodes that we've been recording, is how these things gain value, not because they are inherently valuable, but because somebody decided for other reasons that they should be valuable. And then that logic is sort of imposed on the object after the fact,
I mean, I think that's definitely true. I feel like you've really put it in a nutshell.
A nutshell, not known as a golden spiral, though, just by the way.
I challenge, you know what? I guarantee you, if you Google it, someone's
found the...
On the top of all those little grids are. Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is something that I think exists in the world of art history as well, where somehow it's the year 2025 right now. And it's not at all true that art history is a static field, and we've already decided in 2025 what is going to be important in 2035.
Right.
There are people are rethinking this kind of stuff all the time, and if maybe if we are able to finally jettison this idea of the golden ratio, then suddenly the Parthenon will no longer be considered the most important Greek building if somehow that ends up going away. That's not a serious comment, but it is the sort of thing where, because I think people have started to find this golden ratio stuff in the last 100 years in some of these things, that maybe, these structures or these pictures or whatever get a kind of outsized importance attached to them after the fact. And when we talk about the golden ratio, I think there's a tendency to associate that specifically with the Renaissance and with the school of ancient Greek scholars.
Right.
And we don't really give it credence outside of those two basic contexts. And there's so many different other places where all these concepts come up that certainly weren't informed in any way by Fibonacci, that weren't informed by our contemporary understanding of what the golden ratio is, but they were still thinking about the math concepts and using them. There's one actual theory that the idea of the golden ratio and the idea of the Fibonacci sequence may have actually come from Africa first and traveled through, because Pythagoras actually studied in North Africa when he was training as a scholar. So there's this idea that it actually came from somewhere completely different from all of this like Greek and Renaissance math that we kind of associate it with.
I think to echo what Madarun was talking about earlier, it does seem very curious then that at a very particular moment in Western culture, this is a moment when we have imperial expansion in Europe, but also in the United States. This is sort of like the moment of arguing over slavery, arguing over Reconstruction, the birth of race science. At this moment is when we have the golden ratio emerge as a concept, and it mostly get traced back to Greek and Roman and Renaissance times. So it seems like an interesting echo there. I don't know what to make of that, but it does seem like there's something peculiar or at least notable about it emerging at that very moment, and the lineage of it being traced in a particularly Eurocentric manner.
I know, Chris, that we've talked about this book before, The Secret Lives of Numbers, which provides a global history of mathematics and makes the case that maybe the typical figures we associate with watershed mathematical accomplishments, people like, say, Pythagoras, have actually had a pretty overdetermined or oversized place in the narrative of mathematical history. Or Fibonacci, and this is from a few different places, including this book that you recommended by Mario Livio called The Golden Ratio. So apparently, Fibonacci was reading and learning about the Hindu Arabic numerals, which had been developed in India way before him. And he spent several chapters in his book on sort of, extolling the virtue of what these numbers could do. So the history of mathematics, it seems to me, as a field and as a discipline, is about travel. How these concepts, if they're powerful enough, can withstand travel and hold up to scrutiny, and in fact maybe come to a Pythagoras or a Fibonacci from so many different places. But that's not the lineage that's popular. Most definitely, that was not the lineage that was popular in the 1800s, in the 19th century. That's not the lineage that got established during that time. And Stuart Hall has this essay, The West and the Rest, in which he looks at the division of the world into, the West and the rest, and in which he argues that this drawing of this uninterrupted lineage back to ancient Greece, and therefore establishing this unified notion of what the West was, that was essential for the success of colonialism, that, the conquest of other places doesn't really work without establishing first that Europeans are, one kind of people, that they are unified and that they're distinct from everyone else. And so in establishing that narrative, which again, it's worth mentioning that there's a surge in the interest around ancient Greece as the seat of Western civilization, at the same time that there's this ramping up of European conquest. So in establishing that narrative, you have to ignore all the heterodox and all the heterogeneous influences on knowledge.
That all sounds like a very reasonable inference to make. I don't think that that's a coincidence at all. I mean, if we need evidence, the evidence is there. So there's this article that I show to my students that's a survey article of mathematics from 1902. And in that survey article, it's about the history of mathematics. And in the preamble to the article, the author, who you might be able to guess is a white European male, writes about how there is potentially some history in which we could understand that some of the geometric concepts, the geometry concepts that we normally think about associating with ancient Greece being the birthplace of all of this stuff, some of them may have origins in other older societies, but there isn't a lot of data on that. So let's just go ahead and assume it's Greek. This was in the preamble to this article. And so the evidence is there that people have been willing to just overlook the possibility that their preferred society
right.
wasn't the one that came up with the idea that they're thinking about.
Does this fit into that larger set of concepts that we sort of lift up, we kind of give a lot of value to, in part because they're seen as reflecting some, civilizational superiority, right? Because it does seem interesting, at the same moment that we have, and when I say race science, I'm not just talking about kind of eugenics. The Italian criminologist, or self kind of styled criminologist, Cesare Lombroso, who came up with this sort of idea of the symmetry of the face being a way of identifying who was a criminal. So turns out the best face, the most symmetrical, perfect, non-criminal face is a white guy, right? And I mean, so it turns out, oh, who knew? And you have these ways that criminality, degeneracy, all of these sort of things get mapped onto the face, whether it's symmetrical in a certain way. And so this sort of then justifies all kinds of things, which is related to phrenology, and those kinds of sciences, which isn't to say that anybody who talks about the golden ratio is a racist or something, but it does fit into that palette?
Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate the context. I don't know about this Lombroso guy from before, but I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere out there actually was a eugenicist, past or present, who actually had some golden ratio theories about different, whatever they're theorizing about.
Right.
And I think, so when I think about the golden ratio myself, I think of it as my kind of responsibility when I teach this class on math and art and nature. It's a responsibility I have to talk about it, because to not address it would be, a lot of students would feel like they really missed out. But I think my responsibility is to start by demythologizing it and explaining all of the different ways in which the golden ratio's like association with these kind of cultural things is either specious or just made up, or is incorrect or inaccurate, right? So one of my favorite comments that I've gotten on student evaluations has been at the end of the year, the students will say stuff like, I learned that the golden ratio is mostly bull, but I enjoyed the class anyway. And so there is actually cool stuff that you can say about the golden ratio, just like there's cool stuff that you can say about all kinds of numbers. And so we spend a lot of time talking about other numbers that aren't the golden ratio. But when we do talk about the golden ratio, I consider it my responsibility to show them the stuff that's actually mathematically cool about it. And then we move on. If the golden ratio has a couple of cool mathematical things about it, it doesn't also have to explain the origin of man in order to be useful.
Right.
It's a lot of pressure to put on one number.
Totally. So Chris, so one of the things that we like to ask our guests as we're closing out, this topic is clearly something you're an expert on. We've been talking about your expertise and how that's been incorporated into your classes. But if we weren't leaning into that expertise requirement quite so much, is there an object or a topic that you would have liked to talk about instead?
Sure. The three of us are in our 40s, and we've now kind of settled into like, okay, this is who I am now. And I don't know about you, but I haven't gotten past yet thinking about what I would have done if I had done a lot of things differently. And I do think that if I put my 40-year-old brain into my body when I was applying to college and thinking about what I was going to do with my life, that what I would have been interested in at the time would be actually fisheries biology. So as you may know, I am an avid fisher person. I enjoy fishing a lot. And going along with being someone who's interested in fishing, I think conservation is deeply important. And there are all of these different ways in which actually mathematics can be part of this too. There are all these different ways in which people study invasive species and the effect of invasive species on the environment. And so I think stopping and managing and dealing with invasive species of animals and thinking about kind of the overall health of water ecosystem is a really, really important topic that I find deeply interesting now, just as a person and as a lay person reading from the outside, that if I could be an expert on that and be more of an advocate in that area, I think that that's what I would probably have ended up doing.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that. And if you happen to come across somebody who is a fisheries expert, you just send them our way so we can have them on our podcast. Thanks, Chris, for joining us. And if there's a book that we could hear about, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation. This was my first podcast. As we've hinted at a couple of times, I have written and I'm working on a kind of a wider release of an open educational resource book. I don't want to say textbook because my hope is that it's a little bit more interesting for general audiences, but I am currently using it as a textbook. The title of that book right now is Philosophical Geometry, Finding Math in Art and Nature. And at this very moment, it's in the middle of a round of edits, but it is going to be for free on my website, which is just schris.com. And by the time this episode airs, there may very well be a version of that book up there. But if not, it should be there by January. So thanks.
Well, that's fantastic. And when it is on your website, let us know and we'll make sure to put it in the show notes. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Madhurima.
And I'm Sean. You can find my writing at breakingculture.substack.com. The music for the show was composed for us by Chris Stokes. You've been listening to the podcast So What?